words and images that connect the idea of life as a pilgrimage of faith and how Jesus walks with us on that pilgrimage. In this section, I want to start by reading a passage from the 15th chapter of Mark, and you can move this slide. Then the soldiers led Jesus into the courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting, "Hail, King of the Jews." They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Let me advance this slide. You may wonder, this might be a head scratcher, what this story has to do with a road or a path or a way, but in fact it is one of the small places in the Gospels that allude to the travel Jesus had to do from his condemnation to his crucifixion. And that too was a journey. That was a path. Not a very long one like the road to Emmaus or the road to Bethany, but nonetheless, a path. I was struck when I looked at this text again to pick it for this conversation, that how little it says about what actually happened. That Jesus, they led him out to be crucified. It doesn't actually say they put the cross on him in this passage. We know that from other places. But the one thing that does get lifted up was that they had to force someone to help him. Simon of Cyrene. And all of you who have ever done the Stations of the Cross, who are familiar with that devotion often used in Lenten on Good Friday, know about Simon of Cyrene being called upon to carry the cross after Jesus had fallen a couple of times. But the fact that this is described, and you know how terse the Gospel of Mark normally is about everything, it always says a little bit less than you want to know about any given thing. Well, here it tells us more than we need to know. It tells us who it was and who his sons were. I can only think that Alexander and Rufus must have still been in the congregation at the time when this was written. They wanted to make sure that Dad did not get forgotten in his role in the Passion story. At least that makes sense to my experience of church. In the course of the centuries that followed Jesus' death and resurrection, the story of the Passion and how Jesus came to be killed became at first the central story of Christianity. I really think that the way it is described in the Gospels, and the fact that the Gospel of Mark is, some scholars would tell you, a passion story with a bit of prequel to it, talking about Jesus' life. It is the passion. It is how Jesus gets from arrest to death that is the key part of the story. And I think that is because it was so painful and so troubling for early Christians to consider that they needed to think about it a lot. One of the ways they thought about it was to try to remember exactly what had happened. Of course, the first century or so after Jesus' life, things are a little confused. Certainly by the second and third centuries, there began to be more of a tradition about, locally in Jerusalem, about what had happened with Jesus. And by the time the Empress Helena gets there in the 4th century and Christianity has become legal in the Roman Empire and eventually is favored, there's some investment in actually remembering where things happened. And so the pathway, the putative pathway from the Praetorium, where Pilate would have judged Jesus and let him go to be executed, and the hill of Golgotha was mapped out more clearly, at least in tradition. We'll never know for sure where Jesus went, but a series of streets in the old city of Jerusalem have been collected together as the place, as the route to the cross. They call it the Via Dolorosa, the way of the Street of Sorrows in Latin. And even now, it's one of those things that visitors to Jerusalem see. Those of you on the pilgrimage with Bishop Strickland doubtless saw it. The people I took with me in February walked it as well. And it has been a Christian tradition for many, many centuries. Thousands of Christians have followed that path, and especially in Lent, and most intensely, of course, on Good Friday. People do it again. People come from all over the world to walk those few blocks, sometimes renting a cross to carry with them as a symbol of this. There are big, heavy crosses, there are lightweight ones, but nonetheless, in order to say they carry the cross along this path. It really has been a central devotion, a central religious practice of Christians to remember the passion of Jesus, and in particular, this path to the hill in this vivid way. In the Middle Ages, it was one of the most common subjects of religious art. That whole devotion of the Stations of the Cross that developed in the course of the Middle Ages was really so that European Christians could emulate at home what pilgrims to the Holy Land would do. People came back from Jerusalem saying, well, we got to walk this in the footsteps of Jesus, and so they thought, well, we'll do that here. We'll pick a church on a hill that is the destination, and we'll make a series of stops along the way that will remind us of these places Jesus went. There are lots of ways. I mean, I could say a lot about this. I actually wrote a dissertation on this subject, but the centrality of the Passion of Christ to Christian theology and Christian devotion, I think, resides, as I said, in part because it is so troubling. It is something that we have needed to process for 2 millennia, and we're still processing. We process it every year as we go through the pattern of Lenten observances and through Holy Week. Because it is horrible, but because in the end it is also reassuring that we know that however bad our sufferings are, where there is pain and suffering in life, and there is in every life, and even in places where there is violence, God is with us in Jesus' experience of this suffering. And even from the position of our own pain, our own fear, we can see a divine solidarity with human suffering in this story of the trip to the hill. It happens, of course, in other settings too. And if you'll advance the slide, we'll look at the second image, this time a painting. This might not be as clear to you, but it's a watercolor by a Cherokee artist named John Guthrie, who lives in Talcott, Oklahoma, who is quite well known as a native artist. He's done a lot of work. And this one is one of his several depictions of aspects of the Trail of Tears from 1839. It's called In the Shadow of the Owl. And you can see that in the top of the picture, there's a large owl flying over this straggler line of men and women and children who are walking through the snow westward toward their new home in the Western Reserve, where the Cherokees were forced to go from this part of the country. As you know, hundreds of them died. The trip was a great hardship and a cruel fate for proud people. And in native lore, the owl is a representative of death. To see an owl is thought of as bad luck. But in this case, the owl flies right over them. The span of its wings covers the whole people. And it is a sign of the artist's grief at the fate of these people. It was something that the Cherokee remember still, in a sense, with their own passion plays. At least in Oklahoma, and I'm sure at this end of the Trail of Tears as well. Trail of Tears, that's very much like Via Dolorosa. In Latin, it would be the Via Lacrimosa. But it reminds me really of our Christian story suffering of Jesus because it is reenacted in theatrical performances and remembered in many ways, even today. Because, again, how horrible it is, and how even now, so many years later, the people whose ancestors experienced it need to be reassured and comforted. This is really significant. Every native community has suffered to some degree. The people who inhabited the land on which I now live in Pennsylvania were moved several times, and in the course of that complicated history, with each removal, their tribal structures were further damaged and their culture weakened. First, simply out of Pennsylvania to Indiana, what was then the frontier, then further and further west, until they ended up in Missouri and Kansas, and then, not that long ago, less than 150 years ago, to the Oklahoma reservation that is now their home, which is, as fate would have it, just across the border from the Osage Nation where I grew up. So people whose ancestors were on the banks of the Delaware ended up next to my people, who had always lived on the prairie right there. Our story is a sad one too, and there's more to come about that, but when a people is removed entirely out of its native landscape and moved to a foreign place where things are not the same, the trees are not the same, the animals are not the same, the weather is not the same, any people who depend on and live in such closeness to nature as Native Americans did, this completely ruins their lives. They have to be a different people to be in a different place. And so the destructiveness of this is one that I think European descended people have a very hard time even imagining. It was as though someone who came from Europe to become American would have to give up every vestige of what was significant to them in Europe. And none of our European ancestors had to do that when they came to these shores. So this Trail of Tears is not just a tragedy for the Cherokee, but all of us who have in one way or another benefited from their removal, who have participated in the general removal of natives to faraway places. Because in a way it meant that white America had given up on peaceful coexistence side by side and had decided that in order for the new to prosper, the old had to be removed. Would you advance the slide to the next one? The next one is just a photograph. That's the first one. This is a stock picture taken from the internet of refugees getting on a train to Poland from Ukraine. I could have picked any number of refugee pictures. There are so many places in the world where people are on new trails of tears. In Myanmar, in Sudan, and Ethiopia. There are just too many places. All the economic refugees from Africa to Europe, the people on our southern border, forced by the criminality and poverty of Central America to risk their lives and those of their families to cross a border into a country that has made it clear in many ways that they're not really welcome. And it is a fact of human life that people have been forced into these involuntary journeys at great hazard to themselves. It reminds me of the way of the cross, that at every point in all these stories, there is loss and grief and suffering and uncertainty. I think this is really hard to think about. And I bring it to you, not to sadden you or impress you, but to help you understand how much of this many people carry with them all the time. One of the greatest privileges of being in the United States is that most of us don't have to think about these things all the time. We can watch them on the news. But for much of the world, life is that uncertain. And I ask myself, where is God in this? And what I like to think is that Jesus walks along. That Jesus is the companion of those who have been driven from their home. Jesus is the companion of those who are headed someplace they don't know what it's going to be like. They don't know how it's going to come out. They don't know what life will be at the end. And that at least is a consolation to me, although I still feel tremendous guilt that we are in our secure position seemingly powerless to do much about these forced movements of people around the world. But at least we can see that in our faith there is a place to understand human suffering. Not to justify it, not to ignore it, but to understand that Jesus doesn't forsake anyone. Not just us, but anyone. And I am brought more powerfully close to those stories by images like this. So I can't do the Stations of the Cross anymore without making it a Stations of all the crosses through all the ages, all the Calvaries to which people have been driven by cruelty and by need. I promise you the next section will be more cheerful. But in the meanwhile, I invite you to join me in prayer. Let us pray. Be with us, Jesus, on our path of sorrows. Be with all those who face suffering they cannot avoid, who face loss they cannot escape, who are afraid of what will happen to them. You have been there too, and you have brought God into every hurting life. Help us to help each other and not to add to the suffering of others. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Dr. Erwin. Thank you very, very much.